I was locking the door to the sheriff's office when the radio spit the call that changes the shape of a night. It always happens that way in small towns, a regular, quiet routine interrupted by something that doesn't fit into the ordinary files on your desk. I thought for a second it would be another kid who'd wandered off to a neighbor's, or a parent who'd misremembered a curfew. I had been wrong before. This time I would be wrong in a way that didn't let you sleep for a long time. Dispatch said an 8-year-old Nolan Rigg, missing near the retention basin off Larkham Road. The boy's bike was last seen by Mrs. Klein's porch light, they said. The call came in clipped, the kind of voice Harlan uses when he wants you to listen without screaming. He gave me the coordinates, the description: Nolan, brown hair, blue jacket, little red bicycle with a dented front basket. And then the neighbor on the line added something that made me drive faster. "A clown," the neighbor said before Harlan could cut her off. He saw a clown. Little kid said he saw a clown. I didn't like the word, not because of the picture it painted, but because of what it does to people. The word balloons the fear in a place that otherwise knows its seasons and the hours of the feed mill. It puts a strange punctuation into the ledger of normal life, something uncanny poking through the seams. Bernice Bullock was pulling her cruiser out of the lot when I reached the truck. She was late 20s, broad-shouldered, a core of resolve that ran like a spine through her. She'd been my deputy for 4 years, a steady hand at traffic crashes and a sharp eye for a truck that shouldn't be in town at midnight. We traded the kind of look that says, "Don't get soft." And then we were on Larkham. The road narrows as it leaves the main drag, barns give way to scrub, and the light thins to the dim of highway reflectors. We could see the outline of the basin ahead, a shallow depression ringed by grass and a concrete outflow that cut into the bank. The retention basin had that smell you can only find where water sits trying to be something it isn't. Stale, mineral, the tang of rust if a pipe was old. Nolan's bike was where they'd said, upside down in the mud at the lip of an open culvert. The basket was bent, the chain hanging loose like a broken promise. "Perimeter," I told Bernice. "You want to set it, I'll talk to the witnesses." She already had a flashlight in one hand, her other on the radio. It was routine phrasing, the things you say to keep the scene civil. Volunteer fire would be staged at the old grain elevator. EMS would be standing by. I told Harlan to put them both on standby and to notify county maintenance about the grate. Harlan confirmed, clipped and efficient. He logged it. Lyle Drum stood on his porch with his hands jammed into his jacket, a man who looked like he'd been carved from the land. He was the first witness, and he had the kind of slow words that people use when they're trying to find the right one. He told me he'd been letting his lab out when his grandson came running in, breathless and shaking. The kid, 10 or so, had stuck his head out and said he'd seen a clown near the drain, waving at something in the water. I listened, and I listened with the part of me hardwired for doubt. Clowns show up in stories and on late-night TV. They show up in the basements of people's imaginations. In my line of work, you learn to leave the story in the witness's mouth and not carry it into the evidence bag unless the town gives you a reason to. Still, when a kid says that kind of thing, you don't laugh. You watch. Bernice crouched by the culvert and shone her light into the dark mouth. The beam skimmed off water and mud at first, then landed on the bent iron of the grate where someone had pried it open. The bars were twisted, and there were scratches along the lip of the concrete that suggested it hadn't been a normal maintenance job. Nolan's little shoe lay near the lip. One shoe, mud inside it, no blood. Nothing that gave a clear answer. We set the perimeter. Tape first, then chalk on the concrete to mark the entry point. I made Harlan log our time in and the names of the officers on scene. Procedural stuff. It keeps you honest in the days after when memories blur. We asked Mrs. Klein and Lyle to stay with us until volunteer fire and EMS arrived. I told Harlan we needed them staged, but not in the tunnel. That confined space entry would be county maintenance's call if it came to that. He acknowledged. We didn't have county maintenance yet. "This is where he was," Lyle said, voice tight. "Right there. My grandson says he saw the clown. He was waving. He had balloons." "Balloons?" Bernice said. She sounded more like she was taking notes than making room for fear. "Red ones," Lyle added. He said there were red balloons by the pipe. I didn't like the way the night pressed when I leaned into it. The culvert's mouth dropped straight into shadow. Even the flashlight felt like it had to fight to put the dark away. The sound changed when you pointed your beam into a tunnel. It swallowed up the small noises and returned a hollow exaggeration of what was left. When you shine a light into that kind of dark, you think of basements and raccoons and the things you've looked at before, without finding anything more than stray cats and lost shopping carts. Still, the shoe, the Pride grate, and Nolan gone. That was enough. We couldn't wait for county maintenance if a child was inside. 2 of us, I said. Flashlights. Mark our way. I want tape and chalk on the outside, so it's clear where we came in. Bernice nodded. She had on boots that whispered in mud. We flexed our light beams and ducked into the mouth. The outside light stopped almost the second we did. It was a phrase I would write down later and use it in the report, because that's what you do when you mark the facts. Note the small shifts that seem like trivia until they aren't. The wind cut off like someone pulling a curtain. Sound narrowed to our own breathing and the soft scrape of our boots on wet concrete. It got cold fast. The retention basin held heat through the day and let it go at night, and the tunnel took the rest. The first smell that hit was concrete and damp, clean, flat odor, not the sweet rot I expected. Then a metallic tang, faint, like someone had scuffed a coin across a grate. There were echoes down there that didn't belong to us. They came back broken, like a radio with bad reception. Harlan's voice sounded like that on my headset when the signal slipped. "There are footprints," Bernice said after a few steps, light tracing small impressions in the mud. Small, barefoot prints, spaced like someone who'd been walking slowly. Child-sized. They led inward and then stopped abruptly at a smear of white on the wall, as if someone had dragged a hand along the concrete. The smear was the color of old paint, and there was something red streaked through it, like a child's finger painting gone wrong. "Chalk the mark," I said. We did. It was second nature. Mark the anomalies, log them, take a photo when we could. I told Harlan the time and to start an evidence log for the scene. Even in the dark, you keep the legality of the thing alive. It's how you anchor the strangeness to a bureaucracy, so that it doesn't become free-floating terror. A maintenance ladder jutted down into the main span where the map hadn't shown one. County maps are never perfectly updated. Sometimes utility work changes things and the paperwork lags. Still, the ladder didn't make sense. It shouldn't have been there. I put a hand on the iron, felt the cold transfer to my palm. The light caught something else. Tiny prints in the mud on the metal rungs leading sideways onto a narrow walkway that ran along the inside curve. They were kid-sized. They were recent. We called it in. Harlan noted our entry time and repeated back the ladder. Good. I asked him to get the fire chief to confirm a rope if we needed it, to have EMTs staged at the grain elevator, but told them to keep the staging area clear. Everything about it was careful and precise, because that's what keeps things from becoming personal disasters in small towns. The rules. The rules are a thin membrane over the chaos. We moved slowly, flashlights cutting into the dark like knives. The beams found more white smears, and then a balloon ribbon caught on a jagged edge of concrete, fluttering faintly in our light. It wasn't red, not yet. It was a thumb-length piece of plastic, translucent and dirty. No balloon attached. It felt like a stage prop left in the wings. "Raccoons," Bernice said, more hopeful than she'd meant. We both knew the sound of a raccoon, sudden scrambling, a clink like tin. The sound came from ahead, from a side drain. For a heartbeat, we let ourselves be practical about it. We trained for animals. We trained for the expected. Then the sound changed. It didn't go from animal to human. It went from animal to something else, like a scraping that had timing, like something trying to remember a rhythm. Concrete fingernails, I said to myself in a private thought that screamed for the report form but also sounded stupid at 3 in the morning. A small figure darted out of the shadows and bolted past my light, then another. Not people, not quite animal. Bits of pale fabric clung to something that moved like a dog, but kept its head too high. It had white on its face. At that angle, and in that light, it looked like paint. I should have smelled animal, but I smelled stale sweetness, like a hospital candy jar long emptied. "Raccoons, then." We called out, my voice more authority than I felt. The shapes scattered. One of them hit the wall and skittered along, then bolted into a side tunnel where light couldn't chase. For a second we both laughed, the small burst of adrenaline making the absurdity taste like relief. A false alarm was a blessing sometimes. It told your body to stop preparing for the wrong thing. Then Bernice's light caught something still. A piece of red plastic caught in a crevice. A balloon tie cleanly knotted. Close by, a smear of white, like flour, dragged on the concrete. It shouldn't be there. The prints came back. Kid-sized boots, then smaller bare steps. They led into a narrow throat that angled down beside a maintenance pipe. There was a child's voice then, tiny and muffled, like a radio left under a pillow. It wasn't Nolan's name. It was singing, a childish tune slowed by distance. I could have called a pause. I could have radioed Harlan and told him we were proceeding with retrieval teams and not alone. But the one thing that refuses patience is the thought of a child in a place she shouldn't be. You learn to override the small procedural hesitations when a child's life is the variable. We followed. The tunnel narrowed to a crawl space where the water lapped up to our knees. The light reflected on the wet concrete, painting the ceiling with swimming shadows. My flashlight hit something odd near the pipe. A small smear of white, then a glint. For a moment in that wet sheen we both saw it, a streak of red across the smear, like lipstick smudged by a child's hand. "Oh God," Bernice said, breath flat. Her voice was steady, but there was something in it that tightened the air around us. She'd been bitten in the line before on a dog call, patched up and back on duty that week. She waded forward, moving carefully. She knew the drill for confined spaces. She knew to mark, to note, to keep the pathway. She had a practical compass that pointed at action. I heard a kid whisper then. Nolan's name. Faint and near. The whisper tugged us deeper into a side throat. The wicket held more water, and the light from our beams shivered against metal. The smell here bent toward something sweeter now. Carnival cotton candy left to ruin, and my chest reacted before my head. A small animal panic, the kind your body keeps for primitive reasons. We rounded a bend, and the space opened a fraction to a small alcove. Nolan was there, curled against a concrete beam like a kid who had found a bad hiding place and decided to wait it out. His jacket was muddied. His eyes were glassy from cold and shock. Relief hit me like a physical thing. You don't learn to be a sheriff and not feel the raw public surge when a child appears alive in the dark. The voice in my head that tries to keep everything in file folders tried to catalogue the moment. One child, coherent, hypothermic, but responsive. "Hey, Nolan," I said, the words softer than I meant. He blinked and tried to smile. I crouched and reached a hand out. He flinched, then accepted it. That was when the laughter started. It wasn't the bright, high laughter of a child at play. It fluttered along the concrete like a loose wire and then gathered into a shape. The sound came from the mouth of the tunnel, not the alcove. It was thin and high in some moments, low and wet in others. Someone, or something, was laughing, and it was doing an odd mimic of Nolan's sing-song as if it had been listening and practicing. "Get him!" Bernice snapped. Her voice cut the space in half. She reached for Nolan with both hands, checking his pulse, as I radioed Harlan to call in EMS immediately. Now, we needed heat and blankets and a warm ambulance. Harlan acknowledged, and I heard the crisp exchange that meant dispatch was alive and moving. "EMS en route, staging at the elevator. Volunteer fire notified." As soon as Nolan was in my arms, the lights shifted. The laugh took on a pitch that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. The thing that had sounded like someone's bad imitation of a child's toy dipped into another noise. A skitter that reminded me of how a raccoon moves when it's cornered. It was on the wall, then behind us, then above us. Our beams caught flashes. White paint, the sheen of something slick, an eye that reflected like a metal bead. "Back out," Bernice said, and it wasn't a question. She had Nolan's jacket slung over one arm and a hand on my shoulder. Her mouth was hard. "We move now." I stepped past the narrow throat. The tunnel seemed to contract around us, as if the walls had come in to listen. The sound changed again. It started to stretch our words into shapes. Static thudded in my earpiece like a distant storm. Harlan's voice jumped, then dropped. "Russell, you copy. Russell, you're breaking up." "I copy," I said. My own voice sounded small. "We have Nolan. We are moving out. EMS ETA." There was a pause. The radio's feed cut with a sharp, unfamiliar whine. The last thing Harlan said before the signal bled was, "You're gonna—" And then the carrier went dead, like someone had taken a hand and closed the night over the air. We moved as a unit, careful footsteps in the shallow water. My boots left prints that I knew would be chalked and photographed later. Nolan clung to me like he understood we were the stable thing in the dark. Bernice's flashlight carved a path ahead, and every time the beam hit the concrete there were more smears, white, then red, like someone had been painting to lead us on. There were more small prints too, closer now, circling like a child's game. Then there was a sound that didn't belong to the tunnel at all, a sharp snap, close enough to be a bite, followed by a stifled yelp. Bernice's hand jerked back from the wall where she'd touched it. I turned and saw her pulling her sleeve away, and there was a dark wetness on her wrist. She'd been bitten not by a raccoon or a dog. The teeth were small, too human in spacing, but the marks were quick and clever. "Bernice!" Nolan wailed tight in my arms. The boy's cry pulled at me the way nothing else does. "You are a professional until you are a father, until you are a younger brother, until you are whatever memory of care you carry." Nolan's voice made the haze crystallize into priority. "Get out, get warm, get help." Bernice swore twice, short and low. She didn't drop her radio even though it was dying in her hand, the static crawling in the speaker like a beetle. "We keep going," she said, voice clipped. Her jaw worked. "We get to light. We get him out. Harlan—" she tried to call back. The radio answered with a wet, hollow sound and then went black. The battery icon on her radio blinked like an eyelid. Electricity had a way of failing underground. Tunnels are notorious for messing with reception. Still, we had a protocol. If two-way fails, you move to the next marker and trust the team outside to follow the line you set. I could feel my fingers steady when I marked the concrete with fresh chalk and tore another strip of tape. Our path would be obvious. The tape would hang like a breadcrumb trail. We would be retrievable. Bernice pressed her hand to her wrist where the bite had landed. There was no gushing blood, nothing cinematic. It was a bruise, a cluster of small puncture points with a sheen of wetness and a spreading warmth. She looked at me, and for the first time that night I saw something in that look that was not professional assessment, but the raw insistence of endurance. "This is getting ridiculous," she said, and made a sound half laugh, half sigh. Her teeth were small on the words. "Of all the calls. If I had to write an after-action, that line might make it in." It was the kind of thing that kept you human in the middle of ridiculous terror. It was a way to claim normalcy against the shape of things that didn't fit. We pushed on. The way out should have been straightforward if our markers stayed intact. But the further we went, the less the tunnel resembled the map I'd memorized from sheriff's office binders. Curves that shouldn't exist were there. Junctions we didn't have on record opened like mouths. The smell bent toward the sweet again, and every time my flashlight passed over a white smear, it seemed to pick up a fresh glint of red, as if something had been painting and had not finished. Then the first real image arrived. It was partial, a shoe caught on the lip of a pipe, the fabric of a sleeve caught and torn. Red balloons in miniature, or what I thought at first were balloons, small circular shapes clinging to the concrete like barnacles. One had a crease that looked like a human smile painted on it. The smile was right for making your scalp crawl. "That's not Nolan's," Bernice said. Her voice had gone flat. It was the kind of sentence that sits between two beats and changes the rhythm. "Someone's been playing with props." "No props here," I said, because the word prop felt too clean for what we were seeing. My flash hit something that made me drop the beam for a split second in reflex. It was white, a smear, and then a small handprint, as if a child's palm had smudged the paint while reaching. Behind that smear, the tunnel opened just enough that a figure leaned out. Just a fragment of a figure, really. An arm, pale fabric, and the suggestion of makeup where the light couldn't fully catch it. The pale was wrong. It wasn't the kind of pale you see in a child's coat. It had the texture of makeup smeared on skin, heavy and theatrical. I had the reflex to compare it and thought, stupidly, of the clown from a popular horror movie, the kind of thing people in small towns joke about when they want to make the fear seem less real. I remember the moment like a camera glitch. Beam focused on the pale sleeve, The sound of Bernice making a noise, then something moving quick enough that the air in the tunnel seemed to shudder. It moved like an animal trying on a human silhouette, the limbs too long for the fabric they occupied. White paint sloughed caught in the concrete like peeled wallpaper. Something leapt from the mouth of the tunnel and hit Bernice's forearm. The bite was clean and fast and shockingly small. Bernice's radio clattered from her hand as she grabbed her sleeve to pull it away. The movement was a reflex. Get the injury visible, get the kid out. The tunnel took that sound and broke it like glass. Nolan screamed, his small body rigid in my arms. The thing, whatever it was, skittered back into the dark, leaving a smear of white where it had been. It made a small dry noise that might have been a laugh or might have been something else, and the light from our beam slid over a puddle where red bloomed in the water like spilled dye. My first instinct was procedural. Log the assault, make a report, protect the scene. My next instinct was animal. Kick and reach, and make the darkness answer for itself. But both instincts were tangled up with the thing that had always been part of this job and never really teaches you how to handle fear. Fear that lives in your gut and manages to sharpen your brain at the same time. "Bernice," I said. Her face was pale in the beam. She blinked at me, then at Nolan, then at the place where the smear had been. Her fingers trembled around a small wound. The bite had broken skin. It would be a puncture, sewn and washed and perhaps a scar. It would be processed into evidence with a charcoal swab and a chain of custody form and a photograph file. In the bright pragmatic of it, you could pin down the incident into boxes of procedure. But we were still standing in the wet dark, holding a child who had been singing to a tune he shouldn't have known, with a deputy who had been bitten by teeth too small in the shadow of something that looked like a clown. The radio remained dead. My watch said it had been 12 minutes since we'd entered. Outside, the night was still as a held breath. Down here, the sound moved differently, slower, thicker. Harlan's name echoed in my head like the way you think of the last person you meant to answer. We had to get Nolan to warmth. We had to get Bernice to EMTs. We had to mark everything until our hands hurt. Bernice set her jaw. She crushed her lips together and started moving, carrying her own hurt the way professionals do, like a weight to be shifted out of the way. "Stay close," she said. "We go fast. We keep our beams steady. We walk the tape." I gripped Nolan tighter. He smelled like wet coat and the faint tang of candy from his pocket. His eyes were half shut. I felt ridiculous with gratitude. Alive is always the first miracle in a small-town missing child call. The rest is the paperwork of why the child was where he was and how. We followed the tape back the way we had come, flashlights jittering where the concrete curved. Behind us, something made a noise that was neither animal nor machine. It was a housewife's laugh turned through a gutter. It sounded like someone trying to make a joke and failing. The beam caught a smear of white on the wall, and for a beat there was an impression of a smile painted so wide that it was wrong on a human face. Bernice's breathing changed. It went from controlled to short. She was focusing on the task, on Nolan, but the bite had its own agenda. It brought a slow, hot ache that would throb later. For now, it was a thing she carried without complaint. The farther we went, the more the tunnel tried to rewrite the map in the dark. A junction that should have been a left curve opened into a small maintenance room that didn't exist on any county schematic. Balloons, small, red, deflated things, cluttered the floor like shed petals. For a second, my mind wanted to name it prank elaborate, someone dressing the tunnels for a joke. But no prank has teeth like the kind that had touched Bernice. We made it to the culvert mouth with Nolan in my arms, and Bernice limping, a hand over the small punctures on her wrist. The outside air hit us sharp, the way returning to daylight always does after a place that steals warmth. The boom of the world at the mouth of the tunnel crashed into the narrowness of what we'd be leaving behind. Volunteer fire flashed its lights at the road, and an EMT's small, steady voice called out that they had hot blankets and a heater in the rig. Harlan finally came back on the radio, voice thick with static and a tremor I couldn't tell at first whether it was from the cold or from alarm. "Copy, Sheriff," he said. "EMS en route. Chief's here with the engine. What's your status?" I told him what we had. One child, one hurt deputy, one missing, no longer missing, and a trail of evidence that looked less and less like something that belonged in ordinary files. I heard muffled voices and the scrape of boots on gravel. The world around the basin seemed to spin into a new focus. People doing the things that keep a town whole when it frays. They took Nolan from me into the blanket-lined back of the ambulance. He smelled clean for the first time in hours, wrapped and warm, his breath slowing. Bernice sat on a cooler with her sleeves rolled up, looking at her hand like anyone who'd been bitten by something tries to make sense of the mess on their skin. The EMT checked her wrist and said what an EMT says: signs, vitals, tetanus, and transport if necessary. We did the measured steps. We would write them into the report. Shell casings in the mud, chalk marks, tape set flapping like flags, the bite marks on Bernice's wrist, Nolan's jacket, a shoe left in the mud, evidence that had weight, that lived in the light and could be logged and filed. Those things mattered. So did the things that didn't hold to the light. The white smears we photographed seemed to fade between the way we photographed and the way we processed the film later. Balloons turned to clean concrete when we turned our backs to check our gear. The thing that had looked like a body in the tunnel was gone by the time the county team marked and measured. The balloon ties, the smear, the smile, where they had been, there was only clean stone and a pale reflection. That would come later in the report. The vanishing elements, the things that evaporated when daylight and a team of men with clipboards arrived. For now, the practical world took precedence. Nolan was warm and coherent enough to answer my questions. Bernice's wound would be cleaned and stitched, her tetanus and antibiotic logged. County maintenance would lock the culvert till the engineers could come out. Harlan would put the call into the log, frame it in the timestamps that anchor memory. But when I'm in uniform and speaking into a radio I don't use for socializing, you pry out the facts the way you pry up flooring to see what's rotten. The facts that mattered in the tunnel were the ones I could photograph and file and preserve. The facts that still lived unconsolidated in the dark were the ones you couldn't press into a box. The smell that wasn't quite right, the way a laugh could split like a crack in concrete, the feeling that some small animal thing had been learning how to imitate people and hadn't mastered it. We loaded into the Riggs with Nolan in the ambulance and Bernice limping beside me in my truck. She sat quiet and small, jaw clenched, hand flexing like it hurt to hold still. The men at the grain elevator took Nolan and covered him with hot blankets. The volunteer fire chief kept his face poker flat and practical as he relayed the ETA for the county maintenance team. Harlan stayed at the radio board and fed me updates as we moved back toward town. Later, when we would file statements and the county would sift through the culvert and find only dented metal and mud and a child's shoe, people would ask how something like this could happen in a town like ours. They would look for a human culprit and be relieved if one could be found. We wanted that too. We want answers because they are portable. Fog can't be logged easily. I took one more look at the retention basin before I shut the truck door. The light bled around the edge of the culvert like a bruise. There was a shape of shadow that didn't make sense, a little like someone had sat down and put a hand to the wall. I couldn't make out details. The light was against it and the angle made everything ambiguous. For a sliver of a second I thought I saw a balloon drifting across the water like an eye. Bernice shuffled in beside me. "You're going to tell it until it stops making sense," she said, voice low. "I probably will," I said, "but for now we do the stuff that holds paperwork, evidence, photos." She looked at her wrist and then out toward the basin, and for a second her face was all edges and worry. "We didn't have time for stories," she said. "No, we didn't, not then." Harlan put through word that the county maintenance crew had been delayed by an extra 20 minutes. "Roads," he said, frayed. I ordered everyone to remain at the staging area until they arrived. Volunteers, EMS, and anyone else who looked like they could be helpful. That night, as the EMT warmed Nolan and Bernice sets her jaw and jokes about stitches in that brittle way people do, something else happened that no one wanted to write into a report. The steps we'd left in the mud, our chalk marks, the tape we'd tied, looked from certain angles like they led nowhere. The smear on the wall where we'd seen something white looked clean enough to be dismissed as a trick of light when the county crew finally arrived and swept the area with lamps. And when the photos were developed later, the bulb of what we'd seen in the tunnel seemed to blur at the edges. There were anomalies you couldn't make stick. On the drive back to the office, I called Sheriff Lost, the man you'd call when your county has ghosts in its basement. He's been around the next county over long enough to have a reputation for seeing things adults don't want to face. We had a pattern. Nobody would call him unless it had teeth. The line went to voicemail and then came back with a terse, "I read you," the kind of voice that keeps itself practical. "Lost," I said when he picked up. I didn't preface the night. There's rarely art in formatting fear. We pulled Nolan out of the North Retention Basin. Deputy Bullock was bitten. White paint, balloons, small prints. The radio went dead in the tunnel. "County crew will be out, but I want you to know." He took a long breath. There was no showmanship on the line. He asked me 3 plain questions about evidence, about whether Bernice had photographs, and whether the volunteer chief had seen anything. He didn't laugh. He didn't call names. He asked where the patrol logs were and whether we'd put Nolan in a warm ambulance right away. Then he said quietly, "I've seen this pattern. Keep your patrols tight. Make no assumptions." I didn't like the weight of his words because they weren't dramatic. They were too practical. The kind of thing that meant he understood there was a pattern without needing to say the thing out loud. He agreed to come by as soon as he could get his truck moving. After I hung up, the shivering that sits behind a man's sternum when he has looked into a place with teeth didn't go away. I filed it away with the rest of the night's oddities. Nolan's jacket wet and smelling like candy, Bernice's puncture wounds, the pride grate. But certain things felt too large for the file folder. The laugh that practiced the child's voice, the way the paint seemed to rub off on the tunnel walls like something that had been washed and reappeared, the brief thought that whatever had been down there could mimic sound. We brought Nolan into the station long enough for the night shift to hold him till his mother arrived. When she did, pale, frantic, and then collapsing into gratefulness, I watched the arc of a town reassemble itself around a child. People talk in these moments as if rescue is the end of a story. I wanted to believe that too. I wanted to write the end in neat lines. Child saved, deputy treated, culvert locked. It didn't feel like that for everyone who stood near me in the light of the station's fluorescent bulbs. Bernice left her jacket on the back of a chair. She wrapped her wrist in gauze like a soldier bandaging a wound. She didn't want to go home just yet. She wanted to sit with the radio and the files and not feel like the night had swallowed her pieces. She kept looking at the doorway, as if expecting some silly thing to come through it. I can't blame her. The job is lonely in the places it keeps secrets. I made my notes cold and efficient, the way duty requires. I marked the time of the call, the arrival, the entry, the exit, the time Harlan reported the radio failing. I logged Bernice's bite and Nolan's condition. I made a list of things for the county crew. Photograph anything that looked like paint. Catalog every piece of ribbon or balloon tie. Check the grate for tool marks. I ordered them to be exhaustive. Exhaustive is the word you use when you want to make an attempt at controlling the shape of a story. When the lights in the station finally settled into their night hum, the small rituals began. The slow filing, the printed reports, the coffee that tasted like duty. I sat at my desk with a blanket folded over my legs and tried to make the night's odd edges translate into plain language. Reports like to eat the edges of things. They want facts and timestamps and a chain of custody that makes terror look like an administrative problem. County maintenance arrived 2 hours after we called. They came in a truck that smelled like diesel and paperwork, 3 men in reflective vests who went down into the culvert with lamps and a clipboard. We watched them work the trench with that controlled energy people use when they want to mean business. One man taking photos, another measuring, the third knotting a rope to verify an anchor point. The volunteer fire chief and an EMT stood by with flashlights, muttering quietly about how tunnels play tricks when you're not careful. They found the grate bent the same as we'd left it. They logged our chalk marks and the tape, which still fluttered like a language none of us could read. They photographed where the shoe had been. They noted the damp on the concrete and took swabs. They did their jobs exactly and thoroughly because that's what you do when the ground under a town starts to feel unsteady. And then the other stuff started to thin. The white smears that we'd photographed in the dark, the ones that had gleamed wrong in our flashlight beams, looked like faint water stains in the morning glare. The balloon ties we swore were not tight and clean, when Bernice found them, became little, brittle bits of plastic that crumbled when the county tech tried to lift them. The small painted smile we'd both seen perched like a joke on a pebble turned out to be nothing more than a shadow and a trick of the angle when the light hit just so. You could feel the town's collective lungs exhale a little, Every time a thing that looked like terror was reduced to a maintenance problem. Not everything disappeared. Shell casings were still there, lodged in the soft mud where we'd fired into the dark. We had one of my service weapons on record for the night, 2 magazines worth. The casings matched, and the deputy chief walked them into the evidence room with a solemnity that made the metal feel like confession. The tape we'd hung from the culvert mouth, the one we used to mark our entry, still fluttered stubbornly where we'd left it, a bright line against the grey concrete. Bernice's bite was real and photographed and swabbed. The EMT had documented it with forms and witness statements. The county techs kept peering into the side throat where we'd found Nolan. They called up furtive updates to Harlan. "No body, sir. Nothing we can find aside from what the sheriff's folks logged. We took photos of the ladder location and the prints they marked." One of them, younger, lingered at the lip of the culvert after the crew had packed their lamps. He said nothing, just rubbed his hands together as if to warm them, and then walked away like a man carrying something that didn't belong to him. We ran what we could through the normal channels. Forensics took swabs of the smears and the tape. The lab logged the shell casings and Bernice's swabs for pathogens and foreign trace. Nolan's jacket, muddy and smelling still faintly of sweets, went into a paper bag and into the evidence freezer, with the same sterile indifference you give to anything that might later be used to explain a child's afternoon. For a week, the town felt like it was bending around that small file folder we had on the incident. Nolan's mother wanted to sit with me for longer than a typical witness statement suggests. She'd come in that evening, with her hair wrapped in a towel, the outlines of worry still raw on her face. She'd hugged Nolan until he stopped trembling, and then sat and watched the two of us with a look that made me want to hand her back a piece of the night I'd been carrying. "Did he say anything?" she asked, voice thin. "Not much," I said. "He sang a little when we found him. He was cold. I left out the laughter that had imitated him and the way the tunnel had answered our steps. There are things you say in a report and things you say later over coffee with men who are the kind of friends that let you get close to the parts you don't put down on paper." Bernice slept in the station that night on a cot we keep for people who don't feel safe taking their wounds home. She joked once about scaring her own mother with stitches and stories, and then she pressed a palm to her bandaged wrist and went quiet. In the morning, County EMS drove her up to the hospital for a proper check. The physician on duty was thorough in the pleasant way of professionals who treat open wounds by naming them in sterile phrases: puncture, clean, culture. They took the wound swab and told Bernice to expect a call if anything showed up. She waved it off like a soldier. The lab came back a week later. Bernice's swab showed traces that didn't come up as common animal saliva. There were cellular artifacts that puzzled the techs, something that didn't fit neat categories. It read as inconclusive. The smear swabs from the wall came back with elements of pigment that could not be matched to any brand-new cosmetic easily purchased. Balloons had no fingerprints. The shell casings gave a matching serial number and corroborated the rounds fired, and Nolan's jacket had trace elements of mud consistent with the culvert environment. In short, physical proof that we had been there, that events had occurred, and nothing that explained the thing we'd all seen. Between the files and the coffee, rumor spread. The kind of rumor small towns bear is a social animal, and it needs meat. Some people wanted to believe Nolan had been taken by a prank that had gone too far, the kind of elaborate prank a traveling group of kids might stage for the thrill. Others wanted to find a human face and took turns pointing at the town's drifters and the kids who painted themselves for Halloween. It was a relief to name a culprit, if only for an evening. But a week later, a woman at the feed store told me a boy she babysat had woken up sobbing and talking about clown shoes and a tunnel that smelled like candy. A teacher mentioned a sketch one of her 5th graders had made, white face, red mouth, an odd small handprint on the page. They came to me in different ways: a church usher with a breathless voice, the mayor's assistant with a printed email, a farmer whose son counted balloons he hadn't seen. None of it held together neatly. It congealed into a patchwork of small anxieties. Children more aware than before, adults who stayed a little later at the feed store, porch lights being left on. Sheriff Lost came up 2 weeks after the call. He drove in with a coffee thermos and a patrolman's patience. You could see the lines on his face from years of being upright when other men don't want to be. He didn't grandstand. He didn't bring his own explanation. He brought a notebook and an even hand. "You have the boy," he said, eyes on my hands. "You have a deputy with a bite recorded. You have casings in the mud. You have some marks that don't stand the sun. That's more than a lot of places ever get." He nodded at the report pile on my desk. "Tell me in your words what it felt like." I told him as best I could without sliding into metaphor. I told him how the night had compressed, how our radios had gone fuzzy and then dead, how the laugh had been wrong, how the thing had bitten Bernice with teeth that were too neat. I told him how the paint had seemed to come off just when the county lights arrived, like whatever had been playing a part didn't want a witness beyond the people who'd been there first. He listened like a man who'd been told the same story in different towns and seen it wear different faces. When I finished, he sat back and folded his hands. "Pattern," he said finally. "You and I both know patterns. Not every pattern has teeth you can photograph. Some patterns leave you with things that refuse to line up in the day. You did the work, Russell. You anchored the thing where you could. That's the part people will remember when they want to sleep." He didn't say more than that. He didn't have to. There was a practicality in his tone that suggested he'd seen similar blurs where a call would come in from a county road less traveled, a babysitter's note, a line of children drawing the same thing in crayon. He suggested increased patrol in the area for a week, and that we keep a log of any unusual radio interference and small disturbances, things on the edges of normal police work. He agreed to sleep in the office that night and drive a beat around the retention basins as a show of force and a sign that we weren't blind to what was left behind. That night, I drove the outer roads with Sheriff Lost and Bernice in the passenger seat. She'd insisted on coming with me rather than going home, her wrist still pinked under the bandage. We ran the lanes slow, engine low, lights off when we could, listening for any sound that didn't belong. Below the hum of the cruiser, the night smelled the way it had the day of the call, of cut fields and bait buckets and the faint decay of the world outside town. Sometimes the radio fizzed and popped like static in a kettle. Once, a trace of a child's song wavered through for a second and then was gone. We followed every echo with eyes like men trying to map ghosts. Nothing came of it beyond our own huddled unease. The week after, things changed in small increments that didn't clarify anything. Nolan slept through the night but started waking sometimes with mouths full of dream words that made his mother pull the blanket up to her chin. Bernice had a hard time staying away from the culvert. She visited it during the day with a thermos and a notebook, like a woman trying to make a diary of the place that had nearly taken her. She went down to check the tape and the chalk, sometimes with a camera, sometimes alone. She told me about the way the light hit a particular smear and how once, at dawn, she thought she saw a child's handprint in the mud that no one else could find. We kept the evidence chain tight. The shell casings were entered into evidence and logged. The county sent their final report to our office with an addendum that read like technical grey. No non-human remains found. Paint sample inconclusive. Recommend further interagency review. That report made it into the mayor's hands and into a small headline that read, more or less, "Boy found, cause unknown." The headline calmed a lot of people because it promised closure. It also upset others because it denied a narrative they were beginning to tell themselves about what's dangerous and what's not. People put my name on a list of local authorities who handled it, and that was part truth and part courtesy. I can handle paperwork. I can corral facts and push them into neat columns. I can't make the world more predictable. 2 months later, we got a call from a pastor across the county line. A kid from his church had woken in the night and found a single red balloon tied to his bike. No note, no signs of tampering. Just the balloon, swaying in the early morning when the boy came out to ride. The boy was shaken and came inside to his parents. They called the pastor. He called me because the boy had mentioned, in a trembling voice, the tunnel. We drove to the house in our coats and stood in a driveway under a pale streetlight, while the boy's mother handed the balloon, deflated, slightly grimy, to me like an unwanted heirloom. I turned it in my hands. The knot was a simple overhand. There were no prints on the plastic. It had been there, yes, but it didn't answer why. The town began to stitch around that absence of an answer. Porch lights stayed on later. Neighbors who had once left the keys in cars started locking doors again. The more I tried to pin the thing down, the more it behaved like a rumor with teeth, present where people had either seen it first or trusted enough to speak. It would produce items that made sense only in certain lights and to certain eyes. It would leave us with a child's shoe genuine as a child's absence, casings as real as a gunshot, a deputy's puncture wound, and a single boy safe in an ambulance. And then the rest would go thin, like a painted smile rinsed in morning rain. Bernice took to journaling in small, precise entries. She'd hand me notes between shifts. Checked culvert east wall 0700. Faint smear still visible under residue. No balloons. She kept her entries clinical enough that she could show them to hospital staff and county techs. But late at night, when she stayed at the office and the phones were down to a patient hum, she would go quiet and then tell me, in the kind of low voice that makes you lean toward it, about dreams where she chased a child through maintenance rooms that rearranged themselves. "I'm not scared of being hurt," she'd say once while we drank awful vending machine coffee. "I'm scared of missing something when it matters." Her fingers toyed with the bandage on her wrist. I wanted to promise her certainty, and had nothing more persuasive than a flashlight and a clipboard. One afternoon, nearly 3 months after Nolan, a man in a state vehicle pulled into our lot with a piece of paper and a face that had seen too many seasons. He introduced himself as a liaison from a neighboring county who handled unusual incidents. He didn't say paranormal. He didn't need to. He began by asking about patterns and asked to read our logs. He stayed for an hour, and then added our call to a long list he'd been keeping. Odd missing child calls, reports of mimicry, items that disappear before county techs can confirm them. He showed us a map, the photocopied kind with pins and doodled lines, and told us matter-of-factly that some things travel. He was careful with his words. "Some things," he said, "prefer the margins, the places where light leaks and children imagine. They feed on attention and then move on." There was no theatrics in the way he said it. The sentence landed like dry leaves. "Can you stop them?" I asked, the sheriff in me demanding some kind of operational plan. He smiled in the way a man smiles when a question cannot be answered with plans and forms. "You make the perimeter smaller," he said, "and you make the people inside it harder to touch. You don't let it make the town smaller." We took that the way men take proverbs you can adjust into patrol directives. "Increase evening patrols," he suggested. "Keep the culverts covered. Install motion lights. Document everything." He left a thickly typed report that read as a mixture of folklore and procedure. We filed it under a shelf of things that become artifacts of worry. There were nights after that when I would wake at 2 in the morning and listen to the house creak and try to measure the difference between reasonable fear and something that ate certainty. The station phone would ring with a caller who swore they'd seen a clown in a field. Or a teenager would post a fuzzy photo on the community group, and the comments would light up like a small bonfire of opinions. People debated whether the county should raise the topsoil at the retention basins or put up no trespassing signs. They argued about whether the mayor should call in state police for an official investigation. The hardest thing was that we had saved a child and had a deputy back on light duty, both of which the town kept returning to as evidence that order had been restored. The pragmatic parts of life resumed their shape. A harvest got in, kids went to school, the feed mill's rhythm returned. But beneath the hum of daily business, there was a tautness, like a wire stretched across an old fence that might sing in the wind. One morning, 2 weeks before winter, I went out to check a call about a loose dog and found a red string tied to the mailbox at the end of a lane, knotted just so. There was a smear on the post of something white, like paint rubbed with a palm. It was small and ridiculous, and it sat there like a punctuation mark. I untied the string and put it in an evidence bag, because that's what you do when your town starts folding the edges of fear into its architecture. The lab would laugh at the sample. Paint low trace, no prints. A child's toy misplaced. So why did the skin on the back of my hands tighten? We set up a quiet watch at the 2 retention basins for weeks after that. Not a full-scale operation, but enough that someone would be there if a call came in. Volunteer fire did rounds. Bernice took the midnight shift sometimes and sat in the truck with the heater on and a thermos of coffee that went cold. We took turns not sleeping properly. We drove the back roads and listened for the sound of something practicing voices. There were nights when the static on the radio would smear a child's tune across the county frequencies, nothing more than a glitch. There were other nights when nothing at all happened, and that silence felt heavier than any siren. We learned to measure dread not by spectacle, but by accumulation. The way the town's faithful rituals, lights on porches, kids walking in groups, older neighbors checking in, stayed in motion despite a sense that something had tried to rearrange the margins. The strangest thing, perhaps, came much later and small enough that you could almost miss it. It was a balloon, a plain red one, taped to a lamppost by the elementary school on the morning of a bake sale. Someone had knotted it and left it weighted by a small rock that had a child's scrawl on it. Someone's name half-smudged. No child claimed it when the principal asked at the morning assembly. It sat on the lamppost for an hour and then had been found by a teacher and disposed of. Bernice took that balloon and put the stem in a plastic bag and stored it in her locker. She said she wanted to have something to look at, if only to remind herself that sometimes the things you fear leave behind small, mundane proof. She wrote in her journal that night, "We need to keep watching, not for monsters, but for patterns. It's the patterns that tell you where to walk." We did watch. We tightened our routine. We shared the load among deputies so we didn't carry the night's weight alone. We kept Nolan enrolled in counseling, because some wounds are in the night and don't leave a bruise. We spoke at school assemblies about stranger awareness and how to tell an adult if anything ever smells wrong. We encouraged parents to be watchful without panic. We showed up at community meetings and answered questions with as much transparency as our duty allowed. But there were things paperwork couldn't fix. Once, months after the culvert, Bernice called me in the small hours because she'd been woken by the sound of small laughter outside her window. She'd gone out to check and had found nothing but the neighbor's cat on the porch and a single white smudge on the vinyl siding that wiped away with soap and water. No prints, no balloons, just a smear that wouldn't photograph well and frustrated her. "It won't stick," she said into the phone. "It won't stay where other people can see it except when someone's looking first." She was right. Perhaps that's the nature of what we had encountered. It only fully existed where eyes were alone, and then, as if embarrassed by a sunlight that asked too many questions, it blurred. That didn't make it less real. It made it more dangerous in its slipperiness. One spring night, I stood at the retention basin's rail with Sheriff Lost, and we watched the wind push at the water like a hand testing a skin. Lanterns of stars hung low and indifferent. He said quietly, "You don't get used to it. You just learn which things you can keep from becoming contagions to the town." "What would you do if it came back?" I asked. The way a man asks a carpenter how to fix a door when he's the only one who knows the house's boards. He looked at me with the kind of seriousness that doesn't pretend to be a plan. You make the town's life harder to take. You make people visible. You don't give it corners to hide in. You take a child's toy, and you make it evidence. His voice was flat, practical. Maybe, somewhere else, the words we used were just metaphors for vigilance. Here, they were survival. When the call finally came again, another boy missing, same county, a different creek, a pattern unrolled itself. We answered, and the neighboring sheriff answered, and a network of men who had learned how to keep the town's margins alive showed up. They cordoned off, they searched. They found one child in a heap of leaves under a bridge, crying but unhurt. The child had been playing and had lost his way. That was the practical conclusion. But the parents swore they had seen something with white paint, a human shape that moved wrong. The reports piled up until someone far away began noticing more than a single county's coincidence. We did what we could. We organized watch shifts. We documented. We briefed neighboring sheriffs in quiet phone calls. We told them what we'd seen. The bite marks, the laughter, the radios cutting out. We told them what we couldn't prove and what we could. We told them to keep their eyes open and their children in daylight when they could. Nobody claimed to have a victory. We simply held a larger net. That is how small towns survive strange tides, by widening the circle of who pays attention and refusing as a community to let the edges fray unattended. It is not a triumphant end. There is no trophy. The measure is in the number of nights the kids get home safe. People will ask me, and perhaps you keep asking yourself, whether what I saw that night was a trick of the mind or something that deserves a file stamped with the county seal. I will tell you both and neither. There were the things we could photograph and put in evidence: shell casings, a child's jacket, a deputy's bite, and the time entry on a dispatch log. There were also slippages that light cleaned away, and the sound of a laugh that mimicked a child's song with the wrong timing. I cannot tell you what it was because the thing refuses tidy classification. It behaves like an animal that learns faces, it practices voices, it leaves evidence when it wants to be believed, and removes it when daylight insists on being rational. If there's one thing I can swear to with my oath on the line, it's this. As a small-town cop in Ohio, that night became the thing I woke for. It is the most terrifying nightmare I've ever been awake for. Not because I saw a monster and beat it. I'll tell you honestly, we didn't beat anything that fits cleanly into a textbook. We saved a child. We treated a deputy. We collected what evidence we could and we kept watch. The rest remains a score of oddities that don't add up. I tell you this because the work matters and the watch matters. If you live in a place where your children still run the yards and your neighbors still check your mail, do not let my words be a reason to lock the world away. Let them be a reason to be visible to one another. Keep an eye on porch lights and locks, yes, but also keep your conversations with your neighbors. Let your communities be the kind of place that notices when a child's rhythm changes and makes sure the children see a grown face that is steady. I still patrol Larkham Road sometimes when the moon is thin and the grass smells like turning earth. I still check the culvert every few weeks because some duties don't heal with time. Bernice is back on patrol. She stitches her life together with a very particular brand of stubbornness. We both know different things now about the limits of light. If this story landed like a stone in your chest, then we have done what we needed to do. It has made you think, at least for a moment, about who watches after the small things. If you want to hear more accounts like this one, from small towns with big shadows, stick around. There are more nights where things don't quite add up, and every report we file is a way of keeping them from taking the shape of ordinary life entirely.